He hadn't seen a bobcat in years. He certainly hadn't expected one to come looking for him. The air was thick with the scent of pine and slow-burning summer. It was one of those dusky Appalachian evenings when the shadows stretched long across the hills and time seemed to slow. Not because anything had changed, but because the world was pausing to breathe. Elliot Brooks stood by the edge of his old property line, right where the woods began to climb into the blue haze of the Great Smoky Mountains. He'd walked this trail more times than he could count. 40 years in wildlife service, 20 more in quiet retirement. This land had seen all of him young and stubborn, older and quiet, and lately, slower, softer. The kind of soft that comes when you've seen life take and give, then take again. That night he was walking just for the sake of walking, the kind of walk that doesn't need a reason. He carried no rifle, no tools, just his thermos, a small flashlight, and the old wool jacket that had belonged to his late wife Claire. She'd sewn her name into the inside pocket. Her thread had held even now. He paused near the old fence line, the one he'd stopped repairing years ago when he realized the forest didn't need walls. The wooden post was half swallowed by moss, and the earth had cracked beneath it from spring rains. The field beyond had started reclaiming what once was a garden. No more tomatoes, just goldenrod and wild fennel swaying like dancers in slow motion. That's when he saw it. Still as a stone, maybe 30 feet away, just where the trees folded into evening shadow. A bobcat. Not just any bob, but a large one, far bigger than most grown males he'd ever recorded in the field. Its body was lit by what little light remained, dappled gold and dusky brown. Broad face, thick legs. The black tufted ears tilted forward, slightly alert, but not alarmed. And its eyes, not wild, not wide, but focused on him. Elliot didn't move. Not out of fear he'd lost that decades ago, but out of something else. A memory. A breath caught mid-chest, something old stirring inside his ribs. He lowered his thermos slowly and squinted as if the dusk might be playing tricks. It wasn't. The bobcat didn't flinch, didn't vanish, didn't bolt. Instead, it stepped forward. Just one paw, just one soundless movement on the dry grass, then another, and then it stopped. The air had gone still, no crickets, no birds, no breeze through the pine. Just the quiet hum that only shows up when something ancient is watching. And Elliot said aloud, not loudly, but not a whisper either. Well, I'll be damned. He knew that walk. He remembered that gaze. Not the size, no, that was new, but the rhythm, the weight, the way the animal carried itself. It was like seeing a child again after they've grown tall. The bones were different, the muscles stronger, but something in the way they tilted their head, the way they looked at you. It brought you back. 7 years ago, he had rescued a bobcat cub from a wire snare not half a mile from where he now stood. The memory had never left him, but over time he'd tucked it away like a photograph inside a drawer. Life has a way of crowding out the soft things. The cub had been barely alive, its hind leg twisted, matted with dried blood, its breath raspy and light. He'd carried it home in his arms like a child, kept it warm through the worst February freeze he could remember. He'd named it Remy after Claire's favorite southern novel, the one about survival and coming home. And after months of healing of distance and patience of long silences and slow trust, Elliot had let Remy go. No collar, no tag, no chip. Just open woods and a quiet goodbye. The last he'd seen of the young bobcat was its spotted back fading into tall grass with one backward glance. Until now. Fully grown bobcat was standing at the edge of the very same field, meeting Elliot's gaze with the calm weight of memory. And here's what Elliot didn't do. He didn't step forward. He didn't call the local game warden. He didn't pull out a phone to take a picture. He just stayed, still, watching, because some moments aren't meant to be captured, they're meant to be kept. Elliot had spent years teaching interns and young rangers about animal behavior. Wild stays wild, he'd say. You don't get to be part of their world. You just make sure it's there for them to live in. But standing there with the sun bleeding out behind the hills, and this creature watching him like he mattered, he felt something shift. What if memory wasn't just for humans? What if kindness once given didn't vanish into the soil, but stayed somewhere rooted in fur and muscle and bone? He wasn't sure, but he knew this something had brought Remy back, and it wasn't hunger. Many folks think of bobcats as elusive, dangerous, instinct-driven animals. And they are. But there's a quiet intelligence to them too, a sensitivity that science still hasn't pinned down. There have been studies about feline memory, about olfactory recognition years after separation. Some biologists argue that wildcats can retain the scent of a caregiver for up to a decade. But Elliot wasn't thinking of science. He was thinking of Claire. She'd always believed animals had souls. Not the kind you see in paintings, but the kind you feel when one meets your eyes and something settles in your chest. And standing there that evening, Elliot began to believe it too. It's worth noting bobcat sightings in Appalachian regions have been increasing. And while it's rare to encounter one so close to a human dwelling, it's not unheard of. But this wasn't just an encounter. This was something else. A return. A message. A moment. Like nature had circled back around to say, I remember. If you've ever felt like an animal saw you, not just looked at you, but really saw you, you'll want to stay with this story. Because what happened next, it changed everything. That night, Elliot sat on his porch until long after the stars had filled the sky. The bobcat never came closer, never left the edge of the trees, but he stayed. For hours. And when he finally turned to go, Elliot whispered under his breath, more to the woods than to himself, "If it's really you, I'm still here." The next morning, he woke to find fresh tracks, leading away, then circling back, as if something or someone was trying to say, "Follow me." And that was the beginning of a journey Elliot never could have imagined. He wasn't looking for company. But company found him barely breathing, small enough to fit in two hands, and fighting to stay alive beneath the snow. It was the kind of winter that silenced everything. The kind where the world stopped moving, and the cold felt heavy enough to remember. Elliot Brooks had lived through plenty of Appalachian winters, but that one, the winter 7 years ago, was the first he spent truly alone. The kind of alone that didn't echo, didn't complain, just was. Claire had passed the spring before. Their son Matthew had been gone for more than a decade. The house was quieter than a church pew after prayer. No laughter, no footsteps, just the slow tick of a clock and the sigh of a man who didn't have anyone left to talk to except the wind. He'd retired early from the Forest Service after 40 years. Too tired to train anyone new, too weary to explain what couldn't be written in a manual, how the forest keeps its own kind of time and how animals like people remember kindness and cruelty. That morning, the snow had come early. It wasn't gentle. It came sideways, slanting through the pines like frozen rain, sharp and stinging. Elliot pulled his coat tight and walked the lower ridge, checking an old trap line that poachers sometimes used. He didn't expect to find anything. Those who hunted illegally usually stayed clear of his land. They knew his name carried weight in this county, but at the bend of a frozen creek he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been the wind. Then again, a whimper, thin, rasping and desperate. He followed the noise down to a cluster of deadfall where a tree had collapsed under ice. Beneath the tangled roots, the snow was red. That's where he saw it. A small bobcat cub, no bigger than a house cat, its back leg twisted tight inside a wire snare. The wire had cut so deep that fur and flesh were one. The cub was half buried in the snow, breathing in short, jerky gasps. Its eyes were open wide with the wild kind of fear. For a moment, Elliot just knelt there. The man who'd once known every animal track in this forest suddenly didn't know what to do with his hands. He whispered softly the way Claire used to talk to stray dogs at the back door. "Easy now. Easy, sweetheart." The cub flinched. A low growl, weak but sharp, rattled from its throat. And something in that sound broke him open. He remembered his son's final breath, lungs too weak to fight the infection. He remembered Claire sitting beside the hospital bed, whispering the same thing he'd just said, "Easy now." He shook the thought off. There wasn't time for memory. He pulled off his gloves and reached for his knife. His fingers were stiff and red, shaking more from emotion than cold. Carefully, he cut through the wire, little by little, whispering the whole time so the cub could hear a voice through the pain. When the snare finally came free, the cub didn't run. It collapsed into the snow. Its breathing was faint. He wrapped it inside his coat, pressing it close to his chest to share what warmth he had left. The heartbeat under the fur was small, uneven, but there. He made the long walk home with snow reaching past his knees. When he finally stepped inside the cabin, air hit him with the smell of wood smoke and pine sap. He set the cub gently on a towel by the stove, its body limp-tailed, twitching in dreamlike spasms. Over the next few hours, he cleaned the wound. He worked in silence, just as he had in the hospital when nurses stopped asking questions and simply let him stay beside his wife. His movements were slow, deliberate. He poured warm water over the leg, watching the ice and blood melt into pink rivulets that stained the towel. The cub tried to bite once weakly, then gave up, exhausted. Elliot reached for the small first aid kit he kept for injured wildlife. He wrapped the wound in gauze and murmured to himself, "You'll be all right, little one. You'll see." He didn't name it right away. He wasn't planning to. He'd told himself it was just temporary, a rescue, a duty. But that night, when he poured a few drops of milk into a shallow dish, the cub lifted its head and blinked at him with cautious amber eyes. It wasn't trust exactly, but it wasn't fear anymore either. That was the first time he called it something. "Remy," he said softly. "You'll do." Remy didn't move, just blinked again, slow and steady, like he'd understood. In the quiet weeks that followed, the rhythm of Elliot's life changed. He rose at dawn to feed the cub, sat by the stove through long nights, listening to the crackle of fire and the faint sound of breathing beside him. Sometimes Remy would limp close and rest his head near Elliot's boots. Other times he'd curl under the chair tail, flicking as though testing the line between wildness and warmth. And slowly, something in the cabin changed too. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of small sounds, quiet presence, shared survival. Elliot had lived most of his life studying animals from a distance, measuring them, tagging them, writing reports. But now, every moment was personal. It wasn't about data or duty. It was about care. He found himself talking out loud again, about the weather, about Claire, about the son who never made it to college. The cub didn't answer, of course. But sometimes when Elliot spoke softly enough, Remy's ears would flick toward him. That was enough. People like to think animals can't understand love, that what we call affection is just instinct dressed up in human language. But if you've ever looked into the eyes of something that depends on you, really depends on you, you know better. Kindness is a language older than words. It's the steady hand cleaning a wound. It's the patience to sit in silence with something afraid of you. It's the choice to care, even when no one's watching. And for Elliot, that winter wasn't just about saving a bobcat. It was about finding proof that love could still live in him, even after so much had been taken. One night after feeding Remy, Elliot sat by the window. Snow had begun falling again, soft and slow. He thought of Claire's voice, the last words she'd said before her heart failed. "If you ever get the chance to save something, promise me you will. It'll keep you alive." He hadn't understood what she meant then. But watching the bobcat sleep, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of survival, he finally did. Healing doesn't always arrive as forgiveness or faith. Sometimes it comes in fur and fragile breath. Across America, wildlife rescue centers see thousands of cases like this. Every winter, hawks caught in fencing, deer trapped in ice, foxes injured by traps meant for something else. Most don't make it. But the ones that do, they remind us that life clings even when it shouldn't be able to. And that's what Remy was doing. Clinging. Every morning, Elliot would find him stronger, stretching, limping less, eating more. The golden fur began to shine again. The eyes turned sharp, curious. There was one moment, quiet, almost invisible, that Elliot never forgot. He was refilling the water dish, talking to the cub about how spring might come early. He crouched down, hand steady. Remy sniffed his fingers, then pressed his small nose against the scar on Elliot's wrist, the one left from pulling wire off years of traps. A small touch, a moment of recognition, then gone. But it stayed with him long after. In that tiny gesture, something inside him softened that hadn't in years. Grief didn't leave him. It never does, but it changed shape. Became gentler, quieter, something he could live alongside. He wasn't thinking about miracles or fate, just survival. Just gratitude that in a world so full of endings, one small beginning had found its way back to him. Experts say bobcats are naturally solitary. They avoid humans. Even orphaned cubs rarely imprint. But occasionally, very occasionally, a rescued cub forms an associative memory not based on dependence but on safety. That's what researchers call recognition imprinting. Elliot didn't know that term. He just called it trust. And in that quiet cabin, as winter dragged on, the bond between man and bobcat deepened, wordless, fragile, and real. By March, the snow began to melt. Remy's leg had healed. He could run again. He'd grown restless, pacing near the door, ears pricked toward the sound of wind. The forest was calling him back. Elliot knew that look. It was time. But how do you say goodbye to something that helped you remember who you were? You don't. You open the door. And you hope they find their way home. Stay with me, because in the next part, you'll see what it means to let go without losing. To love something enough to set it free and still carry it wherever you go. That spring morning, the mountains were gold with new light. The last frost had melted from the branches. Elliot walked Remy to the edge of the forest. The bobcat paused, once looked back, and in that single look, just one heartbeat, everything Elliot had lost seemed to come back to him. And then the animal vanished into the green. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. When he opened the gate, the bobcat turned. Just once. And in that single glance, Elliot learned what real love means. Letting go even when it breaks you a little inside. The thaw came late that year. It always does in the Appalachian foothills. The snow melted in fits and starts, patches of green fighting their way up through tired earth streams swelling with ice-cold runoff. The world was waking up again, and so was Remy. By then the cub had grown lean and restless. The soft paws that once stumbled over the cabin floor now moved with quiet confidence. The small growl that used to sound like protest had deepened low, sure and proud. Every morning, Elliot would find new scratches near the door frame where Remy had tried to climb, or a bowl tipped over in the corner. The bobcat wanted more than shelter now. He wanted space. Elliot recognized the signs. He'd seen it in young hawks he'd released in deer that healed and wandered back into the forest. They all shared the same look, a pull towards something bigger than comfort. Still knowing didn't make it easier. He'd grown used to the sound of Remy's small claws on the wooden floor, used to the weight of his quiet presence, close but not tame. Nights felt lighter with another heartbeat in the room. And mornings had purpose again. There's a rhythm to care that steadies a man when grief has hollowed him out. But spring has its own plans. One afternoon, the wind turned warm and the first robins appeared in the yard. Elliot knew the time had come. He couldn't hold on any longer, not without stealing something from the creature he'd saved. He waited for a clear day. The kind of day Claire always said felt like forgiveness. The sun sat soft and golden behind the hills, and the forest was alive again, branches creaking, insects waking the whole valley, humming with the promise of renewal. Elliot packed a small canvas bag, a pair of gloves, a bandage kit, a bit of leftover meat for the journey, and a quiet prayer he didn't say out loud. He carried Remy in a wooden crate, the same one he'd used to bring him home months ago. But this time it felt heavier, not because of weight, but because of meaning. The release site was about a mile from the cabin, just beyond a ridge overlooking a small clearing. He'd chosen the spot carefully, enough cover for hunting a creek nearby for water and distance from people. The path was rough. The earth was soft from thaw mud clinging to his boots. He stopped halfway to rest, setting the crate down and listening. Inside, Remy shifted the sound, gentle but alive. Elliot smiled, breath fogging in the cool air. "Almost there, buddy," he murmured. When they reached the clearing, he knelt beside the crate and unlatched the door. For a long time, nothing happened. Just silence and the sound of wind moving through the trees. Then a cautious paw stepped forward. Remy emerged slowly, every muscle alert. He sniffed the air, nose twitching at the scent of pine, moss, and freedom. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, the deep gold of late afternoon. Elliot stayed still, crouched low, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't quite name. Remy turned his head once, looking back at him. Not fear, not confusion, just recognition. That moment felt like a full conversation between two souls who didn't need words. Then, with a fluid motion, the bobcat slipped into the tall grass. His body blended perfectly with the earth, and light, the rhythm of nature, reclaiming him. In seconds, he was gone. Elliot waited there long after the last rustle faded. When he finally stood, his knees ached, but his heart felt something it hadn't in years, a peace that hurt, but in a good way. He didn't cry right then, not yet. But the tears would come later, quietly over coffee the next morning, when the chair across from him stayed empty. Grief has a strange way of echoing through joy. Sometimes the happiest moments carry a touch of ache. Because when you love deeply, even a wild thing, its absence becomes a kind of silence you can still hear. But standing there under a sky stretching wide and unbroken, Elliot understood something. He hadn't just rescued a bobcat. He'd rescued himself. For months, he'd been living like a ghost, half in the world, half in memory. But caring for Remy had pulled him back into the rhythm of days, feeding, tending, noticing, hoping. The act of saving another life had reminded him how to live his own. People often think of release as loss, but maybe it's the truest form of loyalty, believing something can make it on its own. In wildlife rehabilitation, caretakers are trained not to bond. Don't name them, the manuals say. Don't talk to them. But Elliot had learned that care without connection isn't care, it's procedure. And though he'd done everything by the book, kept distance, limited contact somewhere along the way, that rule blurred. He'd told himself he was teaching Remy how to survive. But the truth was, the bobcat had been teaching him how to let go. There's a kind of grace in wild things, a reminder that love doesn't have to look like possession. It can simply be presence for as long as it's meant to last. And that's what Elliot carried home that day. Not emptiness, but a quiet knowing. In the Appalachian region, many retired rangers volunteer with wildlife rehabilitation groups. They spend long hours nursing injured owls, foxes, and sometimes even bobcats back to health, then release them back to the wild, never knowing if they survive. It's an act of faith, one that echoes something deeply human, to give care without expecting return. That night, as Elliot sat by the fire, the house felt different. Not lonely, just still. He looked at the empty spot by the stove where the cub used to sleep, and instead of sorrow, he felt gratitude. He reached for the old leather-bound journal Claire had given him years ago, the one he hadn't written in since she died. He opened it to a blank page and wrote, "Released Remy today." Watched him disappear into the light. Didn't feel loss, felt peace. Maybe that's what love really is, a memory that knows how to walk away. He closed the book and left it open on the table like a small prayer. Outside, the night came gently. The sky turned the deep blue of velvet, the stars trembling through mist. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Elliot stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold air. The scent of pine and earth filled his lungs. He listened, really listened, and for a moment he thought he heard something moving beyond the tree line. A low rustle, a soft fading sound. He smiled. "Good night, Remy," he whispered. No answer came, but he didn't need one. It's strange how letting go can feel like completion. The end of one chapter, not of the story itself. Elliot felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but less burdened. The grief that once anchored him was now something he could carry without breaking. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or light. It just happens quietly, in a breath, in a look, in the space left behind by something you've loved. That's the kind of moment that stays with you. Wildlife experts often talk about the homing instinct. Some animals, after rehabilitation, travel hundreds of miles and still return near the place they were cared for. It's not always for food or territory. Sometimes it's pattern recognition, smells, sounds, familiarity. But a few scientists believe there's more. A kind of imprint, subtle but real. Elliot didn't know any of that. But he'd soon find out firsthand that memory in wild creatures runs deeper than anyone thought. If you've ever had to say goodbye to a pet, a person, or even a season of life, stay with this story, because sometimes what leaves us finds its way back again. The next few years passed quietly. Seasons came and went in their steady rhythm, spring greens fading into summer gold, then burning into autumn's flame. Elliot spent his days tending a small garden, fixing the porch, walking the trails that wound through the hills. Occasionally, he'd find a paw print in the mud near the creek, larger now, deeper. He'd pause, a smile, and keep walking. But one evening near the end of fall, the wind carried something different. A strange stillness. The birds went quiet. The woods held their breath. And when Elliot looked up from his fence line, he saw two golden eyes watching from the edge of the trees. It wasn't fear that filled him this time. It was recognition. And the story of that night, well, that's when things took a turn no one could have imagined. It wasn't just that the bobcat returned. It was how he returned, quiet, watchful, and waiting, as if trying to say something no human could quite hear. The hills were turning again. Late October in the Appalachians brings a kind of beauty that aches if you look too long. The golds were deeper now, the reds more brittle. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke, and the mornings began with a kind of hush. Only old trees and older souls know how to keep. Elliot had started his days the same way for years. Coffee on the porch, boots, unlaced just enough to slip on, and a quiet nod to the world before speaking to anyone, if he spoke at all. That rhythm had settled in him like roots. But one morning something shifted. It began with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the tense sort. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm or just after a mistake. The birds were gone. Not a single rustle in the hedgerow. Even the squirrels, usually bold this time of year, stayed hidden. He noticed it in his bones before his eyes. The kind of noticing that doesn't require explanation, just age instinct and having lived long enough in the company of things that can't speak. And then he saw the prints. Down near the fence line in the soft dirt beside the last rows of his autumn garden were unmistakable paw marks. Broad, round, steady, larger than he remembered. 4 toes, no claw marks. Feline. A bobcat, but not just any bobcat. The same pattern, the same weight. It had to be Remy. He crouched, fingers brushing the earth. The prints weren't wandering. They circled, paused, returned, as if someone had been waiting. For years, Elliot had hoped casually, distantly, that maybe, just maybe, Remy had survived. It's what everyone tells themselves after a release. They're probably doing fine. Probably found territory. Probably forgot all about you. But wild animals don't return. Not like this. Not after years. Elliot had spent a lifetime tracking patterns, migration territory shifts, seasonal return of predators. And this didn't fit anything he knew. Bobcats were solitary, elusive, and above all else, cautious. They avoided people, especially people who smelled of wood smoke and human memory. And yet, that evening as the sun stretched across the valley in long orange fingers, Elliot saw him. Standing at the edge of the tree line, just where the pines thickened into shadow, Remy. Or so he believed. Bigger now, heavier through the shoulders, his face broader. But those eyes, amber gold, sharp and steady, were unchanged. And he didn't run. He watched, then turned, walked a few paces into the trees, stopped, and looked back. Elliot rose from the porch without thinking, walking slowly to the edge of the yard. But when he reached the fence line, the bobcat had disappeared. The next night he waited. No porch light, no food left out. Just him, a chair, and the cool breath of October. He sat for hours wrapped in the old wool blanket Claire had knitted during her last winter. The kind with the uneven stitching in one corner she'd always meant to fix. Near midnight, the sound came again, a faint shuffle, deliberate, but light. Elliot didn't move. He just looked toward the trees, and there he was. Remy, no longer a shadow, fully present, every movement slow, thoughtful, like he was testing something, not proximity purpose. He stayed there, maybe 20 feet away, body angled sideways, eyes fixed on Elliot. Then, like the night before, he turned, walked back toward the woods, paused, looked back. It wasn't random, it wasn't curiosity, it was an invitation. There are moments in life that shift something inside you, not loudly, but certainly. The kind of moments that press a finger to your spirit and say, "Pay attention, this matters." That night, Elliot felt it. It was the same quiet pressure he'd felt the day his son was born. The morning he realized Claire's laughter had become his favorite sound. And the afternoon he'd placed a trembling cub into the woods and whispered goodbye. Now the wild had returned. And it wasn't just visiting, it was asking. He didn't know for what. Not yet. But something in him, something deep unspoken, knew this wasn't chance. We often think of animals as living apart from us, separate in instinct and intention, but that's a convenience. The truth is, animals watch us far more than we realize. They learn our rhythms, sense our moods, carry memories in ways we don't yet understand. Biologists have studied feline cognition for years, but the emotional intelligence of wild cats remains a mystery. How they process memory, how they recognize places, smells, even people. But science doesn't have a category for this, for a bobcat returning to the only human who ever touched him with tenderness. There was no food, no shelter, no reason, just presence, intentional, repeated. Remy wasn't acting like a wild animal. He was acting like something trying to communicate without words, without fear, just with the weight of presence. In recent years, wildlife experts have documented a small handful of cases like this. Rescued foxes circling back to old properties, eagles hovering over the homes of those who once healed them. But the stories rarely make headlines. They don't fit easily into the boxes we use to explain the world. Still, for those who've lived them, they linger. Not as miracles, but as something gentler affirmations. That kindness leaves a trace. That memory isn't only a human gift. That sometimes wild hearts find their way back to those who saw them clearly once. That scent again. Smoke, earth, iron, the shape of a man, but not like the others. No harm, no chase. He touched the pain and made it quiet. I remember. Remy's behavior wasn't born of instinct. It was born of choice. And Elliot was beginning to realize that something extraordinary was unfolding. If you've ever felt like an animal was trying to tell you something, really tell you, what comes next will stay with you long after this story ends. The next day, Elliot packed a small bag. Not because he planned to follow, but because something in him said he might need to. He checked the radio, tested his flashlight, sat by the porch, boots laced, waiting. And when dusk came, Remy returned. But this time he didn't stop at the tree line. He stepped into the yard, walked halfway to the porch, then turned, paused, and waited. This wasn't a visit, it was a call. And Elliot knew deep in his chest, where grief once lived, that if he didn't answer, he'd regret it for the rest of his days. He didn't grow up believing in signs, but when a wild bobcat stood still, looked back and waited, that wasn't instinct, that was something else. It had been years since Elliot had followed anything into the woods at night. These days he mostly walked the lower trails during daylight, stopping by the old salt lick or the ridge where deer came to feed. His bones weren't what they used to be. His knees creaked, his breath didn't always keep pace. But that evening, as the orange faded from the sky and the shadows took shape between the trees, Elliot laced up his boots tighter. He clipped his flashlight to his belt, but left it off. Some journeys you don't light with bulbs. You let the moon do the talking. Remy was already waiting. Just past the tree line, his silhouette half vanished in the gathering dark. Muscles coiled in quiet readiness, eyes reflecting the last of the light. Elliot stepped forward. No sudden movements, no sound beyond the soft crunch of his soles pressing into dry leaves. The bobcat turned, walked a few paces, paused, looked back, and something inside Elliot whispered, "Keep going." In wildlife biology, there's no formal language for what was happening. Animals don't lead humans through the woods. They don't initiate contact without need, and they certainly don't guide. But that's exactly what this felt like. Remy wasn't meandering. He wasn't looking for food or comfort or even recognition. He was leading. And Elliot, without understanding the why, followed. They moved in silence, man and animal, old boots and soft paws, threading through a forest that had watched them both grow older. About a half-mile in, Elliot felt the shift. The woods grew denser, the air heavier. The familiar paths gave way to undergrowth and fallen trees, places he hadn't walked in over a decade, the kind of land only the deer and rain remembered. Remy would move ahead just far enough to guide, then pause. Wait. Look back, as if making sure his human companion still followed. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't hesitant, it was purposeful. And as they moved deeper, Elliot remembered a moment from years before, maybe 3 months after Remy's first arrival. He'd come back from town that day, arms full of groceries, only to find the cub sitting at the window waiting. Not pacing, not panicked, just there, watching. Claire used to do that too, sit on the porch with her knitting eyes toward the road, knowing Elliot would return, not wondering if, just when. Now it was the bobcat who watched the trail ahead and made sure Elliot was still there. Something had shifted. This wasn't just wild behavior. This was connection. There's something sacred about being trusted, especially by something that doesn't owe you anything. In the hush of those woods, Elliot began to feel it, not the thrill of discovery, but the weight of being chosen. Chosen by something untamed, something that had every reason to forget him, and didn't. Each step further into the forest wasn't just a walk, it was a return, to meaning, to purpose, to the part of himself that still believed in bonds that defy explanation. Science gives us explanations, but sometimes it also hands us mysteries, moments that don't fit neatly into categories or charts. Feline behaviorists say bobcats avoid confrontation, that once released they rarely return to former environments unless food or shelter draws them. They are territorial, solitary, and distrustful. But there are exceptions. Very rare exceptions, like the mountain lion in California that crossed 30 miles of terrain to return to the site where it was once rehabilitated, or the red fox in Vermont that visited the same porch every spring where it had been once nursed from injury. Now in the heart of the Smoky Mountains, Elliot found himself part of such a moment. A living question no textbook could answer. Remy's behavior could be attributed to olfactory memory. Bobcats, like domestic cats, have a keen sense of smell. Studies show they can identify individuals' scents years after exposure, especially during imprintable developmental periods. But scent alone couldn't explain this. Not the pacing, not the glancing back, not the circling. This wasn't a bobcat acting on instinct. This was a creature with intent. Elliot's thoughts drifted as they walked. He remembered Matthew, his boy, had 5 small boots stomping through the leaf litter, a stick in one hand, the other wrapped tightly around Elliot's fingers. They used to come here. Not this deep, not this far, but enough for memories to live in the roots. Elliot whispered under his breath, almost too soft to hear. I couldn't teach him everything. But maybe I still get to protect someone. It wasn't a clean comparison. Remy wasn't his son. But caring leaves fingerprints no matter where it lands. And as the bobcat paused again, waiting near a fallen cedar, Elliot felt something tighten gently in his chest. The ache of memory laced with a strange new hope. They came to a narrow ravine, not deep, but steep enough to be difficult. Elliot paused, catching his breath. He looked down, wondering how his knees would take the descent. Remy turned, stood at the edge, tail flicking. Then, in a moment Elliot would never forget, the bobcat walked back, stood beside him, waited. When Elliot finally took the first step down, slow and careful, Remy followed at his side, pacing him like a shepherd would. The gesture was small, quick, but it lingered. A wild animal slowing down for a human. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, but out of something deeper. Loyalty, maybe. Recognition, or just memory wrapped in fur and gold eyes. In the stillness of that forest, Elliot heard her voice again. Not in sound, but in memory. Claire, during their last winter together, holding his hand and whispering, "If you ever find something worth saving again, promise me you won't turn away." He hadn't understood her words then, but now, following a bobcat deeper into mystery, he felt their shape settle over him like a second skin. He wasn't just following Remy. He was answering a call that had been waiting inside him for years. If you've ever felt led towards something without knowing why, this next part is for you. Because sometimes what begins in silence ends in a cry for help no one else could hear. After nearly an hour of walking, the forest began to change. The ground sloped harder. The scent of ash drifted faint on the wind. And up ahead, just beyond a thicket, Elliot saw something that didn't belong. A rusted snare, broken branches, and a flash of blood on the ground. Remy growled, a low rumbling sound that didn't come from fear but from warning. Elliot stepped forward, carefully, slowly. And what he found beyond those trees would shake everything he thought he knew about wild animals, family, and what it means to be called back, not for closure, but for rescue. He thought the bobcat had come back for him. But standing in the half-light of the forest, Elliot realized Remy hadn't come seeking comfort. He'd come seeking help. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became. The scent of pine faded into something sharper, iron smoke and oil. The kind of smell that doesn't belong in wild places. Elliot slowed his steps. His flashlight beam brushed across branches, bent unnaturally low, bushes trampled under heavy boots. And then he saw it, what Remy had been trying to show him all along. A trap. Old, rusted, still biting. The metal teeth glinted in the thin moonlight. Nearby, another one half buried under leaves, and beyond that, a third. A pattern forming a cruel ring. He'd seen setups like this before, during his ranger years. Illegal snare lines designed by poachers to catch whatever crossed their path. Fox, coyote, sometimes even a deer. But this one was too fresh. Remy padded ahead, tail-twitching muscles tense. His ears flattened and his breath came quick low. That's when Elliot heard it, the faintest sound, like wind pulling through a narrow hollow. But it wasn't the wind. It was a cry. Just beyond a fallen log lay a small clearing no wider than a room. In its center, a female bobcat, her coat matted with dirt and blood, was caught in a leg trap. The steel jaws clamped high above her paw. She was alive, but only barely. Beside her, two tiny shapes moved, a pair of kits still new to the world, trembling against their mother's side. They mewled softly, voices thin and uncertain, more instinct than sound. Remy growled low and deep, circling the edge of the clearing. He didn't lunge forward, didn't attack. He just stood there, watching pacing eyes darting between the wounded cat and Elliot. And then Elliot understood. Remy hadn't come looking for the man who once saved him. He'd come because someone else needed saving. Elliot dropped to one knee, careful not to startle the mother. He'd done this kind of work before, cutting traps, calming wounded animals, but never this close to an adult bobcat. One wrong move, one flicker of fear, and the entire moment could collapse. He spoke softly, steady as a prayer. "It's all right. I'm here now." The female hissed, weakly, teeth flashing, but she didn't strike. Maybe she knew somehow that help had arrived. Elliot reached into his pack and pulled out his multi-tool. The metal was cold in his hand. He worked the hinge of the trap with slow, careful pressure, whispering all the while. Remy stood beside her, no longer pacing, eyes fixed on Elliot. Every breath from the bobcat seemed to match his steady, deliberate patience. Finally, with a sharp metallic click, the trap released. The mother pulled her paw free, trembling. She didn't run, didn't flee. She just looked at him, exhausted, eyes wide, with something that felt almost human. Elliot tore a strip from his sleeve and wrapped her leg gently, just tight enough to stop the bleeding. The kits pressed against her small bodies, quivering, and for a brief moment the forest itself seemed to hold still. Man. Animal. and mercy woven together in silence. Elliot sat back on his heels, breath shaking. The air tasted like rust and rain. He thought about how many times he'd seen cruelty like this, humans taking what didn't belong to them, laying traps for creatures who only ever asked for space to live. It had always angered him, but tonight it felt different. Maybe because this wasn't just another rescue. It was a circle closing. Years ago, he'd saved one life in this forest, and now that same life had led him here to save 3 more. He wasn't sure if that was coincidence or grace, but either way it felt like redemption. There's something remarkable about how animals remember not just faces or scents, but safety. They know the shape of gentleness, the tone of a calm voice, the rhythm of a heartbeat that never meant them harm. Remy had carried that memory for years. It had become part of him, a map etched beneath fur and bone. And when danger found his family, he'd followed that map back to the one place he'd felt safe, back to Elliot. Scientists might call it associative memory or scent imprinting. But to anyone who's ever looked into the eyes of a rescued animal, it feels simpler than that. It's gratitude living and breathing. It's love in its most primal form. Wildlife studies show that bobcats are fiercely protective parents. Females raise their kits alone, hunting through exhaustion, guiding them through every danger the woods can offer. But if she's trapped, if she's silenced, the young rarely survive. Elliot knew this. That's why he stayed long after the trap was broken, making sure she could walk. He spoke softly, using his voice the way a lullaby uses rhythm to calm, not command. And as he worked, a memory flickered through his mind, Claire's voice soft and steady years ago in their kitchen after a storm. If you ever find yourself called to help, don't question it. The right things never shout, they whisper. He smiled faintly. You'd love this, Claire, he murmured. Somewhere nearby, Remy twitched his tail as if he'd heard. When he finally stood, Elliot felt different, lighter somehow. The ache in his knees, the heaviness in his chest. They were still there, but smaller. He realized he wasn't tired anymore, not in the way he used to be. For years, he'd carried his grief like a badge proof that he still remembered. But now, kneeling in the dirt beside a family that might live, because he'd answered a call, he felt something shift. He wasn't just remembering. He was becoming again. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not erasing the pain, but letting it be repurposed into something good. As dawn crept across the sky, a thin ribbon of light spilled into the clearing. The female bobcat rose on shaky legs, tested her weight, and nudged one of the kits toward the brush. Remy moved beside her, not leading this time, but guarding the rear. Before disappearing into the woods, the mother turned once. Her eyes caught the light, amber glowing fierce. Then she vanished. Elliot exhaled. Slowly. He'd seen countless animals return to the wild, but this was different. He didn't feel like he'd released them. He felt like they'd released him. We live in a world that moves too fast to notice the small miracles, the moments when nature meets kindness halfway. But sometimes in the quiet heart of the wilderness, something happens that makes you stop, makes you remember that goodness still exists quietly, faithfully doing its work unseen. For Elliot that morning wasn't just about saving a family of bobcats. It was proof that love, real love, the kind that expects nothing back, leaves echoes. Even in the wild, even after years of silence. If you've ever wondered whether one act of kindness can ripple through time, stay with me. Because in the next part, you'll see how that morning in the forest led to a moment that would test everything Elliot believed about courage, loyalty, and what it means to stand between danger and grace. Elliot began the slow walk back toward home. The forest around him was waking the calls of distant birds, the chatter of leaves, the world exhaling after a long night. Behind him, he could hear faint movement, not following this time, just watching. Remy stood at the edge of the clearing, still and steady, eyes locked on the man who'd once carried him through another winter. Elliot nodded. "Go on," he said softly. "You've done enough." But as he turned toward the path, a sound broke through the calm, the low rumble of an engine far off but closing fast. He froze. Remy's ears shot up. The bobcat stepped forward, alert tail rigid. The poachers were coming back. And what happened next would demand everything Elliot had left to give. The forest had just begun to breathe again. And then the sound came, low, metallic, approaching fast. Remy had brought Elliot to save a life. Now it was Elliot's turn to save them all. The engine sound wasn't loud yet, but it was sharp, one of those mechanical growls that doesn't belong in the woods. Not a logging truck, not a hiker's four-wheeler. No, this was something different. It was coming straight for them. Elliot turned slowly, eyes narrowing toward the distant rumble. The forest seemed to close in again. The early light vanished beneath a cold shadow of urgency. Remy crouched low, muscles, tight eyes sharp and flicking between Elliot and the trail. The bobcat wasn't just alert, he was warning. Elliot understood. The trap was only part of it. The poachers weren't done. They were coming back. Everything changed in a breath. The clearing where just moments before a family had been rescued now became a danger zone. The snare line, the scattered tools, even the footprints, they weren't abandoned. They were active. Elliot scanned the space, measuring it like a map. They were maybe a mile from the closest ravine he remembered, narrow, steep, vehicle-proof. He didn't have time to wait. Didn't have a weapon. Didn't even have a solid plan. Just an injured mother, 2 trembling cubs, and a bobcat who trusted him enough to lead him here. So he did what instinct, quiet, and agile told him to do. He moved. He started with the kits, scooping them gently into his flannel shirt, like warm beating stones. The mother, shaky but standing, leaned against him just long enough to catch his scent. Elliot whispered, "Come on now, I've got you." Remy trotted ahead, weaving a silent path through the trees. Not fast, not frantic paced, precise. Enough for the injured mother to follow. Enough for Elliot to keep up. The cubs whimpered once, then went silent in his arms. Warm bodies tucked against his chest. He felt every heartbeat, fast and desperate. Behind them, the sound grew louder, closer. Cracks in the underbrush, a muffled voice, 2, maybe 3 men, and then the sharp click of a firearm. Elliot didn't feel fear, not exactly. What he felt was clarity. Everything he was doing had purpose. Every step, every breath, every decision, it all lined up like it had waited years to matter. The forest around him, so familiar and patient, now leaned in to help. Branches parted. Just enough roots didn't trip him. The trail seemed to remember his feet, and through it all, Remy kept glancing back. Checking, guiding, trusting. It wasn't just man helping beast. It was something older than that, something shared. A quiet promise passed between 2 creatures who had once saved each other. In moments of danger, instincts rise, but instincts aren't just survival, they're memory. Elliot wasn't thinking like a civilian. He moved like a ranger again. Remy wasn't acting like a wildcat. He moved like a sentinel. And together they weren't just fleeing. They were protecting. That's the part people forget. Protection doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks fast. Sometimes it carries. Sometimes it follows a bobcat's lead and prays it remembers the way. They reached the ravine just as the first echo of tires hit the trail. The path narrowed between 2 steep embankments, no more than 3 feet wide. A place Elliot used to bring students to teach them about erosion runoff, how the land shapes itself. He hadn't been there in years. Now it might save lives. He slipped inside, first lowering the cubs to the soft dirt and extending an arm to the mother. She came slowly, limping but determined. Remy brought up the rear, body low, ears back. The moment they vanished beneath the ledge, headlights spilled across the clearing they'd just left. The engine cut. Voices barked. A door slammed. Then silence. They were close, but not close enough. Huddled inside the ravine, Elliot held his breath. He could hear twigs snap above them. Footsteps slow sweeping. The poachers were searching. He laid a hand gently on the mother's back, feeling her shiver. The kits pressed closer. Across from him, Remy stared upward, completely still. His golden eyes locked on the movement above. Ready. Waiting. And in that moment, Elliot saw something he would never forget. Not an animal protecting its territory. Not a beast ready to fight. But a father. A partner. A soul who had chosen not to run, but to stay. When one of the poachers drew too close, boots crunching no more than 10 feet above the tension in Remy's body surged. He didn't growl, didn't lunge. He simply shifted, positioning himself between Elliot and the threat. Elliot whispered, "Not yet, friend. Not yet." And then a shout, another engine. Different this time. Familiar. A patrol vehicle. Elliot had left his secondary radio on when he left camp. He hadn't expected it to reach this far, but maybe the signal had bounced. Maybe luck had finally taken their side. Whatever it was, the poachers scattered. Fast. Boots pounded, someone cursed, and then stillness, real stillness. It was over. Not just the chase, but something deeper. Elliot sank to the ground, chest heaving, heart thudding slow and full. He looked over at Remy, still standing, still watching. Their eyes met, and in that quiet look, Elliot felt it again. That this bond, this loyalty, wasn't a fluke. It was a choice. It had always been a choice. People think wildness and love can't exist in the same breath. That animals act only on instinct, but Remy had risked everything, not for himself, but for his family, and for the man who once carried him out of a frozen trap 7 winters ago. If that's not loyalty, if that's not love in its rawest form, what is? If you've ever wondered whether animals can remember, protect, or even care, the final part of this story may change you. Because what came after that night wasn't an ending. It was a gift. By the time the patrol officers found them, the sun was rising. Elliot stood beside the mother and her cubs, arms folded, eyes tired but clear. Remy had already disappeared back into the trees, silent, sure, and still watching from somewhere just out of sight. The vet team arrived and Elliot helped lift the injured female onto a soft gurney. She didn't resist. The cubs were safe. The family would heal. But what happened in the months that followed? That was something no one expected. Not even Elliot. Most wild animals once released vanish for good. But not this time. This time something came back, not just a bobcat, but a deeper kind of trust. The weeks that followed passed like a gentle thaw. Quiet, healing slow. The mother bobcat recovered at the regional wildlife center, her leg mended by careful hands and rest. The cubs, no longer trembling, grew stronger by the day, nursing, pouncing, testing the boundaries of their little world under a watchful, loving eye. Elliot visited when he could. He didn't speak much, just stood behind the glass window watching the family curl together in the straw, their breathing soft, steady. Remy never showed up at the clinic, but somehow Elliot always sensed when he was near. Tracks appeared in the soft dirt outside the conservation gate. Once a tuft of golden-gray fur caught on a branch. The staff said it could have been any wildcat, but Elliot knew. Remy was watching, never too close, never too far. Just present, like an old friend standing at the back of the room making sure everything was going to be all right. After 3 months, the family was ready to return to the wild. Strong, whole, together. The wildlife officers had picked a spot far from roads deep in the protected forests Elliot once patrolled. A clearing where no traps waited. A place where the cubs could grow into their own. Elliot was there for the release, not as a ranger, not as a rescuer, but as someone who had come full circle. He helped lift the transport crates from the truck bed. He didn't rush, let the moment take its time. When the doors opened, the mother bobcat stepped out first, confident, her injured leg now steady beneath her. The cubs bounded after her, clumsy with youth, but sure of where they were going. No ceremony, no big moment, just fur brushing through tall grass and the quiet rustle of freedom. Elliot stood there a while, his hands resting on the empty crates. The sun filtered through the trees in long shafts. A bird called overhead, and then, from the shadows at the edge of the trees, Remy appeared. He didn't approach, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching the family vanish into the trees step by step until the forest held them close again. Then Remy turned his head toward Elliot. Their eyes met across the clearing, quiet and sure. A moment without language, but full of meaning. A thank you, a letting go, a homecoming. It lasted only a few seconds. Then Remy too disappeared into the brush, and this time Elliot didn't feel sorrow. He felt settled. Some things in life don't come with applause or witnesses. They just happen softly between heartbeats. That morning wasn't just the end of a rescue, it was the restoration of something Elliot thought he'd lost. Purpose, connection, hope. He'd spent years in quiet grief, tending a garden of memories no one else could see. But one wild creature had found his way back, not once, but twice, and in doing so reminded Elliot that the heart has its own seasons. And that healing, like the forest, often arrives quietly disguised as something small. A paw print, a backward glance, a life restored. For many, bobcats are symbols of solitude, mysterious creatures of the wild, seen but rarely understood. But the truth is, they're more than their silence. They are survivors, they are parents, they are loyal in a way we've barely begun to comprehend. This story wasn't about taming the wild. It was about recognizing the humanity we share with it. Remy didn't need Elliot to live. He came back because something inside him remembered kindness. And maybe that's what we all want deep down. To be remembered not for what we took, but for how gently we showed up. Elliot returned to his quiet cabin, tucked beneath the same pines that had once held his sorrow. But now his mornings felt different. He still drank his coffee slow, still laced his boots with care. But sometimes when the sun broke through the mist just right, he'd spot a movement at the edge of the woods. A shadow, a shape, golden eyes blinking once. And he'd nod, just a small gesture, because words weren't needed anymore. They never really were. So now I ask you, have you ever been changed by an animal? Even once, has a creature ever reminded you that gentleness still matters, or that love can take forms we don't always understand? If so, maybe you're part of this story too. And if this story meant something to you, if it stirred something quiet inside your heart, go ahead and like this video and subscribe for more stories that speak softly but stay long. Help protect and heal wild animals like Remy, those who survive despite everything. We invite you to leave a super thanks or donate through the link below. Every small kindness helps build a world where animals aren't forgotten, and where love, quiet, loyal, and fierce, can always find its way back home.